Hi, welcome to Courageous Journeys. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thanks so much for joining me today. Have you been diagnosed with bipolar disorder or maybe borderline personality disorder? It's possible you've been diagnosed with those things and maybe some other things, or maybe you've been diagnosed with PTSD, CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, or a number of other things. But there's 6 primary diagnoses that people that have abuse histories tend to be diagnosed with. And today I want to talk about borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder. So first, just a kind of a quick word about my thoughts about or on diagnosing and, on diagnosing, I guess, in general. So first of all, I think that there is a time and a place for being diagnosed. And I believe that a lot of diagnoses that people are given mental health wise are important in different ways. Where my concern comes in as a therapist who has spent nearly 20 years doing this work is that, and working in particular with people who have histories of childhood trauma, is that so often somebody will go to even their primary care physician, a therapist, or a psychiatrist, and share that they've got a history of abuse or share some of the symptoms that maybe they're struggling with, and be given a diagnosis that's a pretty significant diagnosis. And often when you're given that diagnosis, if it's a doctor or psychiatrist giving it to you, they'll usually send you home with a prescription for medication, or often, depending on the diagnosis, multiple medications. Again, I think that there is a time and place for medication. I think that medication can play a really important role for people at certain times to help them manage a very chronic condition and or just kind of get through a really difficult period. So I'm not completely anti-diagnosis, nor am I completely anti-medication. What I am anti about is somebody getting a diagnosis simply because they've shared that they have a history of sexual abuse and experience the normal reactions as a result of that abuse. That's what I have a bit of an issue with. So, as I said, anxiety and depression are very common diagnoses for people no matter what your history is. And then post-traumatic stress, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder. Those are the primary diagnoses that I tend to see. What I have experienced in my time doing this work is that with PTSD, bipolar disorder, and borderline personality disorder, that with each of those, so often the people that I work with who have been given those diagnoses don't necessarily actually meet criteria for those diagnoses, but they fit enough of the symptoms, and there's enough kind of historical stuff happening now that when somebody shares that they have a history of abuse, oh, well, these are the diagnoses that they tend to be diagnosed with, so okay, you must, let me give you this diagnosis. But the thing about, this is true for PTSD or CPTSD as well, but particularly with bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder, is that both of those are things that you can't really cure. Bipolar disorder is a very chronic condition that that no amount of therapy is going to resolve or heal. For true bipolar disorder, that is the reality. A personality disorder is also not something that can be cured or healed. When you really look at what the diagnosis is and all of that. So my problem is that people are often given these diagnoses who really don't meet the criteria. And actually, if you look at the symptoms that they struggle with, fit very perfectly with the normal reactions to somebody who's been sexually abused as a child, or in many aspects, any abuse as a child, but especially sexual abuse as a child. So to get a diagnosis that is on your permanent medical history of a personality disorder or a chronic mental health condition like bipolar disorder, when in fact, maybe the real issue is that you were abused and haven't been able to heal from it yet, that doesn't feel good to me. And I know that it doesn't feel good to the people that I've known and worked with over the years that have been given those diagnoses. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that today, those two diagnoses specifically, in part because last week I did a live YouTube video on the documentary Heal. And in that, I briefly kind of talked about my thoughts around diagnosis and medication. So the first thing I want to say is if you have been diagnosed with PTSD, CPTSD, bipolar disorder, or borderline personality disorder in particular, and you have a history of childhood abuse, or just a lot of chaos and dysfunction and unhealthiness in your life as a child, I want you to talk to your therapist about the normal reactions and consequences to those experiences. I'd like you to have a conversation about the struggles that I've had that led to this diagnosis, or just the struggles that I have in general. Are those normal reactions to being abused? And my guess is the answer is probably going to be yes, at least if that person has a good understanding of abuse. And that's important because what happens so often with being diagnosed is one of two things, and sometimes it's a little bit of a combination of the two things. On one hand, being given a diagnosis can feel like a relief. It can really feel like, oh my God, now it makes sense. I'm not crazy. I'm not just stupid or lazy or whatever. I'm struggling. I keep struggling because of this, whatever this diagnosis is. So in many ways, it can feel incredibly relieving. It can even feel hopeful in a sense, like, okay, now that I know that this is what it is, I've been given this prescription, now I can feel better. Now I can get out of bed. Now I can stop stressing over this or obsessing over this or whatever it is. So on one hand, being given a diagnosis can be helpful in many ways. And it's possible that the medication that you're given as a result of that diagnosis might be helpful in some ways as well. On the other hand, what I see happen so often is that people are given that diagnosis, whatever it might be, and in saying, okay, so this is what it is, this makes sense, this is why I struggle. And maybe you know that you've done a lot of things to try to feel better and it hasn't really worked. Okay, so this is why I struggle. I have this personality disorder, I have bipolar disorder, I have PTSD, I have whatever it is, depression. Okay, now I get it. it makes sense. I'm just going to take this medication or whatever, and it's going to be helpful. Or I'm going to do this therapy for a while, and it's going to be helpful. What happens is that it can also leave you living up to the expectation of that diagnosis. What I mean by that is that even if you think back to being a child, or even possibly in your workplace, when a parent or a boss kind of labels you in a way of being the ambitious one, being the smart one, being the goal-oriented one, being the lazy one, being the silly one, being the clown. Teachers often will label too, and I'm not degrading teachers at all. But we get labels from different places. And what happens? We often tend to live up to those labels, right? We do. So when you're given a diagnosis and you go home and you get online and you do all that research to understand it better, and you get on forums and you read people's shares about how they are living with whatever that diagnosis is, you feel at home in part, which is a good thing, but it also kind of creates a situation where you just kind of accept that this is the way things are going to be. And that isn't good, predominantly if that diagnosis is actually a misdiagnosis, which happens quite frequently. I've worked with a lot of people over the years that have been given any number of diagnoses. When they've shared with their doctor or their therapist how they're struggling. And if they share that they have a history of abuse, then even more quickly they're likely to be labeled. But when you really look at the ways that you struggle or the symptoms that you experience, if you're able to look at what are the normal ways of reacting, what are the normal ways of coping, dealing with being abused as a child, my guess is that your symptoms or struggles would be much more in alignment with that than a mental health diagnosis specifically. Now, complex post-traumatic stress disorder is a very, very much a newer thing in terms of it being more broadly known in the mental health field. It actually, I haven't looked at the newest DSM, but I know in DSM-4R that it was not actually a diagnosis. You could not be diagnosed with CPTSD. And I understand, or maybe I'm even feeling a little confused now, DSM-5, I don't think it made it in there either, now that I'm thinking about it. I haven't needed to look at a DSM for a long time, so I apologize for any confusion. But the point is that CPTSD is a very new thing in terms of it being more broadly understood. But CPTSD actually came about because people with a history of childhood abuse, in particular sexual abuse and neglect, didn't really fit the criteria for PTSD, but were being given the diagnosis anyway, which happens all the time. The same is true for bipolar disorder. A lot of people being diagnosed with bipolar disorder who don't really fit the criteria, but fit a couple of the pretty significant criteria. So, can you relate to this? Do you have mood swings? Can you feel pretty kind of happy or excited about something one moment, and then 2 minutes later or 20 hours later feel very differently about that same thing? If you're like most people that I know, the answer is going to be yes. And there's reasons for that. That's not a normal, healthy way to react or to feel about things, but that is a normal reaction to a lot of the things that people experience and how they struggle. Does your mood fluctuate quite significantly, sometimes very quickly, or over a relatively short period of time, or seemingly on a dime? Like you might be in a really great mood, really excited, really looking forward to something, and then you're not even quite sure what happened, but suddenly you're like feeling all aggravated about that or something else, and I'm not going to go to that, and what was I thinking? And so you're up and down from really high highs to really low lows, right? Are those symptoms related to bipolar disorder? Absolutely. Are they also a normal way of the inability to regulate emotion when you've been abused as a child? Absolutely. Because as a child, you were never taught, well, none of us are taught actually, which is part of the problem, that there's a whole range of feelings and that it's okay to feel whatever it is we're feeling. But when you are abused as a child, you have really intense emotions that you try to suppress, that you deny, that you avoid, that you minimize. And when you do that, you're kind of disconnected from them when they can come up. They can be easily triggered, and then you push them down. When you've been abused as a child, your sense of self is incredibly affected. You don't feel good about yourself. You assume that other people aren't going to feel good about you either. So let's say you're really looking forward to meeting up with a friend. And, maybe you've been feeling really lonely. Maybe you've been kind of struggling a lot. But you've been really looking forward to getting together with this friend. And then that friend sends you a message and says, sorry, I'm not going to be able to make it. So you're feeling really excited, really looking forward to it. You get this message and immediately you feel completely deflated. Maybe even feel incredibly angry. Maybe feel incredibly depressed. And there's a good chance that you're likely going to say something to yourself like, I shouldn't have looked forward to it. I should have known something was going to happen. I shouldn't trust that person. Why does this keep happening to me? Of course, she's not going to want to spend time with me. Why should she want to? Like, there's all different kinds of things that can go on in your mind from a simple text. Is that a symptom of borderline personality disorder? Yeah, or maybe even send back a nasty text to your friend. Is that a symptom of borderline personality disorder? Yeah. Is it also a natural reaction to feeling betrayed, not feeling like you can trust people, feeling horribly vulnerable when you do allow yourself to trust somebody and then they let you down, taking things personally, feeling like, of course, your friend isn't going to want to spend time with you because why should she? Look how bad of a friend you are, right? That's not a personality disorder that makes you think or feel those things. That's the way that you learn to deal with. Those are symptoms of being abused as a child. And of course, there's other things that can create that too. But of course, most of you watching this have an abuse history or have childhood wounding in some way. So ultimately, what I want you to really take from this video is that if you've been given a diagnosis, please, whether it's with your therapist or even just doing more searching, listening around the struggle that survivors have, recognize that maybe this diagnosis, even PTSD, but this diagnosis doesn't have to be a life sentence for always struggling with the criteria that led to that diagnosis. It doesn't mean that you're always going to have to struggle. And a personality disorder isn't, like I said, it's not something that can be cured or healed specifically, at least not in terms of the medical aspect of it, the treatment plan aspect of it. It's about managing symptoms and regulating your mood. But if you can recognize, okay, all of this is related to how I learned to deal to the betrayal that I experienced and how I learned to cope with it, then you can say, okay, so what I need to do is heal the thing that created all of that. And then those symptoms naturally lessen and over time go away. Now, I want to be clear. Don't stop taking your medication. Do not stop taking your medication if you are on medication. Under no circumstances is that a good idea. But I do want you to have a conversation with a therapist about, are these symptoms normal reactions or just reactions or struggles or however you want to say that to abuse histories, to struggling with a lot of dysfunction as a child. And then talk about, okay, how do I work on healing that? And then also you could talk about it, especially if you feel like your medication hasn't been helping really. Okay, can I work on weaning off of this medication? You never want to stop taking any sort of, really any medication, I would say, but especially any psychotropic medication that you've been given as a result of a mental health diagnosis. You never want to just stop taking it on your own. It can lead to really, really bad stuff. Please do not ever do that. But you can talk about maybe weaning yourself off. Because if you're on pretty heavy-duty medications, it's hard to connect to do the healing that you need to do. Because one of the benefits of a a lot of the different kinds of medications that you take for significant struggle emotionally is that it keeps you kind of at a very stable level emotionally. But much of the time, that is kind of a lack of emotion. It's not necessarily that it keeps you at a really good, healthy place. It's that it keeps you from really experiencing emotion in general or fluctuation in emotion. Well, really to be able to heal, you have to be able to connect to some of that. Now, in the beginning stages, kind of being in that space where you're really not feeling much emotion, there could be some benefit to that. So I'm not saying, the goal is to not take any medication at all, but talk about that. And most importantly, I want you to recognize as an individual that the diagnosis that you've been given may be accurate and it may not. If you have a history of childhood difficulty, and that can mean so many things, obviously abuse, trauma in some way, but really dysfunction. If you were uprooted a lot, if your family moved around a lot, even being a military family, if you were being abused especially, but even if you were just kind of an only child especially, but like a military family moves around quite a bit, that can be really difficult for a kid. That can create a lot of issues with feeling stable, with trust, with building relationships, because why do you want to put a lot of effort into building friendships when you're going to have to grieve it in potentially a year or 4 years, right? So even that can be kind of a difficult, chaotic childhood. It doesn't mean your parents did anything wrong or anything, but it still can create impact. If you grew up in a community where there was a lot of chaos, violence, people who experienced a lot of trauma, financial difficulties. There's so many ways that as children you can experience a lot of dysfunction. If in your own home there were a lot of children and not enough resources, either time or money or food, that can create a lot of struggle as well. Having a sibling that struggled a lot in some ways, even if you really didn't necessarily have any issues, even if your parents handled it pretty well, that can create a lot of difficulty for you. So there's a lot of different ways that you can be affected in pretty significant ways. So again, I don't want you to throw out the diagnosis completely. I just don't want you to see that diagnosis or see that label as what is possible for your future, what is possible for how you have the capacity for how you can feel in your future. So, if you are now finding yourself struggling after watching this with a diagnosis that you've been given, please share in the comments, because I want to be able to address whatever your concern is, because it is not my desire to make anybody feel badly in any way for a diagnosis, for medication. I don't want anybody to be afraid of what it might mean or anything like that. I just, ultimately what I want you to come away with is not feeling stuck. Because I know that that's something that can end up happening for a lot of people. That whole idea that we live up to the expectations placed on us. And when you're given a label of any sort, we often tend to live up to that label. And so I want you to know that whatever label you've been given, even if it was by a family member, whatever that label may be, you are capable of far more than that, and certainly worthy of far more than whatever that label may suggest you are capable or worthy of. So, letting go of the idea of what a label or the restrictions that a label may place on you. Thank you for watching. If you have a question related to this video, please put it in the comments. If you have a question generally that you'd like me to answer around wounding, healing, or abuse, please send to QandA@courageousjourneys.com. I will place that link in the description of this video, and I would love to have you join me. Check out my website at courageousjourneys.com. I'll place that in the description as well. I will look forward to seeing you next time. Have a beautiful rest of your day.